Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Shelley Rogers, and I am part of the web team here at Liberty Fund. I want to thank you for joining us today for the latest installment of From the Shelf with Curator Arnold Kling. Before I turn it over to Arnold and our great friends, Tawni Ferrarini and David Henderson, I wanted to let you know in about 30-40 minutes, we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions, and I will prompt you to ask those live. You can either use the Q&A or the raise hand feature, and I will get you into that queue. Arnold?
Okay, well, first let me ask people to introduce themselves. Tawni, why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Tawni Ferrarini, and I'm broadcasting from Liberty Fund here in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I serve as in a scholarship role or scholar role. I'm based out of Florida State University, and many of you probably know me through the Common Sense Economics Project. And it's in its fourth edition, recently released. So we encourage people to go out and read. If you have any questions, reach out by email or one of our social media channels.
Okay, and David.
I'm David Henderson. I'm a research fellow with the Hoover Institution. I'm an emeritus professor of economics with the Naval Postgraduate School. I also blog at EconLog, which, by the way, which Liberty Fund runs, and which Arnold started. And I started a Substack about 6 months ago called I Blog to Differ, but I think you find it by going David R. Henderson Substack. And so I used to say I'm the last generalist under the age of 70, and I can no longer say that.
Yes. And it's unfortunately, it's not because you're no longer a generalist.
Right.
Okay. All right. So the book we're discussing is Making Sense of Chaos by Doyne Farmer. And his background is quite interesting. You know, he starts out in physics. He attends kind of a notorious conference involving physicists and economists. And I heard about this conference years ago from former classmates of mine who described it as the physicists couldn't believe how deeply into mathematics the economists were. And the economists, of course, had walked into this hoping that the physicists would teach them better math, and they sort of walked into it believing that math was the key to everything. And this conference had some fame. I know one of the economists, at least one of them, was a Nobel laureate, Kenneth Arrow. And the physicists were about equally well known. Doyne Farmer at that point was not a super well known guy, but he's there. And what the physicists came away with was sort of a shock at how the economists were trying to simplify things in one direction by making the assumption that humans were individually optimizing, calculating extremely well, and just perfectly rational, self-interested people, this sort of economic man, and trying to derive everything from very simple assumptions. And the other thing that might have struck them, it certainly struck Farmer later on, is how they modeled everyone as the same, the so-called representative agent. And this representative agent would, design an optimal consumption path, and so on. And so it just seemed like not a good way of starting out. So the problems that the physicists were having was not with that the economists weren't using sophisticated enough math, it's that they were using overly simplistic assumptions. So what did you folks make of that critique, the critique of the economists' assumptions?
I can go first or second.
Go first, please, David.
Okay. So I've got to admit that I started off not hostile, but skeptical. Because I'm so used to people criticizing economics who don't know economics. And I had to work, I thought I could read this book, 280 pages in 5 hours. I took about 8 hours because I had to reread certain sentences and paragraphs and go to the footnotes and really think about it. And then other parts I could read very quickly. Bit by bit, I became more positive, more understanding and sympathetic to what he was saying. So he did move me, but I would add that even though I said I'm a generalist mainly in microeconomics. And he hardly talks about microeconomics. He talks as if everything going on in economics is macroeconomics. And I think his criticisms are well taken from what I know about macro. But, and I'll get, maybe I'm jumping ahead,
Yeah.
but I want to say something about how I think he really blows it when he talks about how to deal with global warming. And it's because he doesn't really take seriously or maybe even understand microeconomics.
Well, and I'm going to push back a little. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. And so my connection with him was one, I really did. I hesitated going into the book and, because I thought this is a frontal attack on economics. And throughout, he reinforces, no, this isn't. I just want to go and compare and contrast the two models. And I thought he was starting from an individualistic, standpoint where he was trying to go from the bottom up to kind of get a sense of what happens once you really take a sneak peek at all these agents who, rather than start from the assumption that they're all rational agents, they're unique in their thinking, they're utility maximizers, they're business owners pursuing profits, they're consumers trying to get the best consumption bundle possible. What if we just turn that on its head and say, okay, now we don't have rational agents. Actually, he goes in and assumes the opposite in part of his work. And he says, we have zero intelligence agents. What happens then? And then if we make that assumption, how can you try to make these predictions about what they're going to do when they're relying on what he calls heuristics? In the Doug North world and some of the other institutional worlds, we call them social habits, customs, and norms. What happens when we try to make predictions based on incomplete information and really adaptive expectations rather than rational expectations? And I thought that was a unique approach. There still are like voids there. And I, like you, David, I read it much more slowly than I anticipated because I was gobbling up, checking footnotes, but I was also listening to podcasts. And by the way, there's an excellent podcast out there that Doyne has launched with the help of somebody who's relatively young. Helps you kind of rethink of what we've been doing and why have we been doing what we're doing as economists in the mainstream.
So you want to elaborate on that latter point a little bit? Sort of what does he think maybe we've been doing wrong and what would he do to change it?
What do we want? He has the 3 pillars. Do we want to talk about those for our listeners? Yeah. So in there, when we look at the economic world, we have 3 basic pillars, as he calls them. And as you have these homogeneous individuals, and these are what we call our agents. And if you're individuals living in a household or operating a business, you've got this utility function that you're constantly working on perfecting so that you can take the world around you and you want to make those decisions that with the highest probability bring about the most happiness or the most reward at the least cost. And what you're doing is when you know that you have, in the simple world of consumers and businesses, you've got the 2 entities, they're acting and interacting, and they're going to take into account their own preferences and realities and expectations and such, but then they're also going to attach probabilities to the other actors' actions and interactions. And they understand that the people on the other side that are interacting with them in these beautiful markets is that they're going to go about the process of making their own decisions, doing the same thing, where they look at all possible opportunities and they're assigning what is it? Well, they're assigning the likelihood that we're living in a world of risk. We don't have any uncertainty. And so eventually what you do is you settle down in what we call this equilibrium state, a steady state. Then when you hop over and you look at Doyne's model, his complexity economics model, he turns all of that on its head. Would you agree with that, David? Is there
Yeah, I
any
think that's
tweaking there?
Yeah, there could be, but I think that's basically it. Yeah.
Now go ahead and tweak.
Yeah, so that's what I think what, in some sense what he means by chaos, that, the standard approach, I don't know, you didn't finish the pillars, but the pillars are these.
Utility maximizing agents. You have the agent with these beliefs that you can assign expected probabilities to what they're going to do and the outcomes that they're going to achieve. And then everyone's trying to solve for this equilibrium value.
Yeah, so you can sort of mathematically solve for an equilibrium state, and then you can say, well, what happens if you shock that equilibrium state in some way? And you can make it's a very simplistic way of looking at the world, but you can actually make it quite complicated by having people having to look into the indefinite future, which is what this sort of idea of rational expectations or forward-looking expectations is all about. His idea instead is that, well, individuals, they're not solving the calculus of variations. They're just saying, well, I'll look at my bank account, and if there's enough in it, fine. If I'd like a little more in it, I'll save more. If I think I've got enough, I'll buy more. And that's, I think, what he means by heuristics. Just people following simple rules of thumb, and it's more realistic, and it allows for differences. And what part of his experience was trading on Wall Street. And if you ask an economist to model Wall Street, they'll have a representative individual who knows everything except for sort of some unknown things that are unknown by everybody. So it's impossible in conventional economics to describe two traders with two different opinions, which is sort of weird, because why would there be any trading at all?
Right.
So
Difference of opinions is what makes horse races. That was the
yeah.
oldest I learned in the 60s and 70s.
So when he is willing to talk about agent-based modeling with different agents having different trading rules using different information sets, he's introducing a really important element of realism into his stories, and you can see how that would be a lot more useful in doing real world Wall Street type of stuff, which he had that experience of.
Right.
Yeah, you want to say something, David?
Well, yeah, one of the points I thought you made well in your review of his book is that we can't understand the stock market. Well, okay, if economists with these models were right about the stock market, there'd be almost no trading. There'd be way less variation in prices than there is. And I just want to tell my anecdote. I arrived at University of Rochester Business School as an assistant professor in 1975. I knew very little about finance, but it was probably like the fifth best finance school in the country. And I went to their seminars. I was fascinated by it, but there was this really sharp guy named John Long, and I argued with him like well past dinner time. I was single, because I was saying, well, if enough people want to buy this stock, the price will go up. And he was denying that. And it was basically because in his model, everyone had the same information, so the price had already gone up. And it was just so strange to me. And then I want to just tell the anecdote that he tells about Markowitz, because Harry Markowitz won a Nobel Prize for his model. And I've marked it. I think I can find it quickly here. No, I can tell it by memory that Harry Markowitz didn't even follow his own model in his allocations to in the kinds of stocks he bought.
Yeah.
That was just very striking.
Yeah, well, I had a similar experience preparing for a seminar by Fisher Black, who probably should have won a Nobel Prize. And
Yeah.
this was in his period at MIT where he was very unhappy, and he had to couch his kind of unique worldview in kind of MIT lingo. And so part of that lingo was to say, well, let's assume an economy where, everyone understands everything about the economy. We don't allow people to make errors. And my line was, well, that there are agents in the economy who don't understand its operations, as evidenced by the paper we're discussing, by the paper that you wrote. Which was like a classic young, obnoxious Kling.
Or insightful.
Yeah.
But that really was the world. I mean, you were in grad school at the same time. That was the world that was emerging among economists, is sort of this perfect information, everybody knows everything kind of world. And that's he's fighting against that. And I think I give him credit for that. I also give him credit for the agent-based approach as potentially a lot more fruitful than sort of writing down a set of equations that describe one person. Let's just turn a bunch of people loose on a computer. And nowadays, like just within the last couple of years with these artificial intelligence, large language models, the cost of doing that and of sort of tweaking your computer model and tweaking these heuristics and tweaking interactions has gone way down. And I think we're going to see just a lot of movement of research, at least in economic theory, away from people scratching on notepads and writing down equations, and moving toward this kind of agent-based, turn a bunch of bots loose in an economy and see what happens. I think the real potential what's one thing that's strange is that to me is that Farmer then may get back to David's critique of the fact that he's doing so much with macroeconomics. He says we can arrive at a single prediction. So, we can predict the outcome of COVID lockdowns using these models, or we can maybe predict, the outcome of a climate policy. My guess is that the right way of doing this is probably not to generate a single point prediction, but to simulate a bunch of times, what they call Monte Carlo simulation. And he is certainly aware that you need to inject some, random elements in here. And you're going to get different results. I mean, that's part of this chaos theory story, is you'll get different results from slightly different initial conditions, different sort of random things that you introduce along the way. And then what you should report then isn't like, oh, here's a single prediction, you're going to get this much output reduction from this COVID policy, but sort of a range of possible outcomes. Do you want to talk about sort of what you found troubling about his sort of macroeconomic approach then?
I would, just for a minute, and then Tawni can. So one of the people who I learned a lot from, I was never a student, but in a way I was, from reading all his work, sometimes when he'd come out to UCLA and visit, going to one of his talks, was Milton Friedman. So of course, one way I start off a book on economics is look in the index and see what he says about Friedman. And every particular thing he says is negative. And part of it is because he goes after Friedman's methodology, which I think is Friedman's Achilles heel. But there's one part where he goes after him on page 106. He says the underpinnings of the Chicago School of Economics, led by Milton Friedman, used idealizations such as perfectly functioning markets and rational expectations. No, they didn't. That led to conclusions supporting the school's libertarian leanings. All right, but he makes it sound like that's why they did it. But once economic models began to incorporate more realistic assumptions, the results became more nuanced and conditional, and most of the earlier results were shown to be wrong. In a book with lots of footnotes, there's not a footnote. So who's he talking about? What's he saying? That's the first thing. The second thing, I look for Hayek. And Hayek is not in the index and he's not in the article. And yet there's a Hayekian tone to this. Now, Russ Roberts in his Econ Talk thing, to his credit, raised Hayek. And I was wondering, how's Doyne Farmer going to answer? And it turns out it was a pretty decent answer. So Farmer was familiar with Hayek, but didn't think it was important to talk about him. And I found that very strange.
Yeah, and I highlighted and put exclamation points right next to his comments on Friedman on page 106 as well, because I thought he doesn't know Friedman. He's not really understanding his position in the literature. And I did notice the absence of Hayek. And it's interesting. I was just like, okay, he knows Hayek, but he didn't bring him into the writing after listening to the podcast. But I think that he has some valid points in here, because when we look at the standard or the mainstream economic model, and we have this homoeconomic or economic or
Homoeconomic.
no, there we go. It's just homo. So you say it, Arnold. We got to have somebody say it properly. Homoeconomicus. There we go.
Homoeconomic. That's it.
There we go. Assumption that every agent is the same, and they're pursuing this, they're rational, and they're pursuing one thing and one thing only. And he constantly, Farmer in here, points to them being selfish, these selfish individuals. And I thought, no, we needed to back up from that assumption. It's the self-interested individual, and the self-interested individual takes into account the mutually advantageous actions and interactions of the transactions, so to speak. And that I thought was missing from what he was doing. That's one. We're talking about the actors here. And I love the fact that he's going to the agent-based models, because I do understand the limitations of the general equilibrium model and how economists are trying to analyze different situations and policy responses to external shocks. But when we hop over into the COVID discussion, I found some of his arguments very compelling, especially when he started doing these simulations by industry. And he ranked them in terms of importance. And I thought that that was a compelling piece. Instead of treating each industry the same, each individual within those industries as these rational agents, selfishly pursuing whatever their end goal happened to be. Once we relax those assumptions and we see, okay, we don't have these types of individuals, each individual is going to respond to this pandemic in a different way and at a different rate. And he was able to go back, because of the computational power that we have today and the relatively low cost of the data, extracting the data. He found some compelling information and stories that he could go back and he could rinse and repeat and get similar results. So I think that it was a story that was worth telling, that it was one that complements what is coming out of mainstream economics versus replaces. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I thought that was one of the best parts, because he said he predicted the British economy on an annualized basis,
right,
would, GDP would fall by 22% and it fell by 23 or vice versa, which is pretty damn good. And he's talking about, well, if you don't have this input, you can't have that output. And I'm going, haven't you heard of Leontief? And then like 10 pages later, he talks about Leontief. So he has heard of him. He's using him correctly. Can I add one, because I might have sounded a little too critical. Can I shift it a little and add something that I thought was profoundly insightful on his part?
Yes. All right, here. Of course, Arnold.
It's up to Arnold.
It's up to Arnold.
So on page 63, he says, and there's a background behind it, but I'll just give you his bottom line and then briefly the background. He says, Adam Smith argued that specialization makes the economy work better. Our work here shows that specialization also boosts the rate of innovation in the economy. And this is based on a term I had not heard something called trophic levels in an economy. And the idea is that if you have an industry
Tropic.
producing some good, and there are all these levels behind it. So think of vertically, it's way up there, and it depends on this input, and that input depends on this input. Well, what that means is if there's a little economic progress, a little technological change in, say, 3 or 4 of those stages, you can get a big increase in productivity for given inputs at the final stage, because there was all that little change at each level, and that's specialization. That's increased specialization. I just thought, I'd never thought of it, but once I read it, I thought, that makes total sense.
Yeah, and that ties in with the classic Austrian idea of roundabout production. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Which, by the way, people have kind of dumped on, and I've never totally understood why they dumped on it.
Yeah. So, Tawni, is there anything that you found particularly like, novel insight or something that you bookmarked positively in the?
Well, the positive is I really feel like he has a compelling case, because as an institutional economist, now the door is open where we can actually go in and relax some of the assumptions of the homogeneous nature of these agents, who, rather than just trying to pursue maximizing their utility and through the rational expectation models, now we really can get our arms around why institutions matter. We can peel back the various layers of onion. Of course, policies in South Korea are not going to have the same policy effects in, Uganda, or even in the United States and North Korea. So I have to understand more about what it is that he's doing. And my biggest problem with him, I think, is the selfishness. That selfishness assumption, which I think that because he assumes that individuals are selfish, which in my mind leads them to be greedy and exploiting others and just out for themselves versus pursuing helping others in mutually advantageous ways. I wonder if that would change anything for him if he made that slight tweak, because he goes in, he's got a full frontal attack on classical liberal economists. I mean, that I find very interesting. And then the Chicago school, as defined by Friedman and others that we revere. So, I did have, my hair was raised when I started reading about this. And then I listened to a couple of his podcasts. So I just want to know more about what it is that he takes issue with. I understand that Friedman wasn't all about the equations and such, but Friedman was using the technology tools and the data sets available to him at the time, especially when you look at some of his work with Anna Schwartz. But I think that with the advancements in cognitive science, along with the low-cost computing power, and now the richness of the data sets that we have, it would be so interesting to see what Milton Friedman would do with the data of today and the conversation that he would have with somebody like Farmer. That, I think, is a compelling kind of scenario to imagine.
Can I add a footnote to that?
Yes.
That he criticizes classical liberals. I don't think he ever uses that term. He uses a term that I hate because it's so made up, which is neoliberal. And it's like, okay, name them. I know of only one economist who calls himself neoliberal, my co-blogger, Scott Sumner. There are no others. And Milton Friedman used the term once in a Norwegian article in 1951 and didn't even refer to himself as a neoliberal. And so this is just this term that's thrown around. And that relates to, like, if you look at how he thinks about the economy and inequality, he cites Piketty, who's very biased. So people like Phil Magnus have drawn on this treasury economist Splinter and others who've laid out how Piketty and Sayaz really kind of mess up the data. And I don't think he's familiar with that.
Yeah, I think it's a lack of familiarity. And I wonder if we helped him gain familiarity, if that what changes would take place in Farmer's world. I find him very approachable through the book and through the podcasts and such. I would love to sit down and just have coffee with the man and, hear about what he's doing and his approach. You can tell he's frustrated because he hasn't gotten the recognition, and he wants recognition not in order to pursue all of the accolades that would come to him. Is he really believes in his soul, in the depths of his soul, that this model is going to lead to better policy recommendations that are going to conquer and tackle some of the biggest issues that humankind deals with, especially climate change, pandemic responses, and the list goes on.
Yeah, and of course, ironically, that's where I'm sort of least enthusiastic about it. I mean, I'm enthusiastic about the methods, but I think even with these better methods, you're going to fall short of coming up with sort of top-down policies that are going to be as effective as he believes.
And you made that point in your review right near the end, Arnold. And when he gets to climate change, he cites all these bad things that he thinks are going to happen. And he has one reference. He doesn't, I don't think he's aware of something like Stephen Kunin's book, Unsettled. And so that's the first thing. The second thing on the micro level is if you think, so there are two things. Let's say we think climate change could be really bad. There are three ways to go: adapt, geoengineering, or cut carbon. And most people have chosen the third without thinking too much about the first two. But let's say we decide that's the best way to go. Here's where microeconomics is relevant. Because if you think the way to do it is cut carbon usage, you don't have to do what he does in one of his chapters and say, here's what's happening to the cost of solar. Here's what's happening to this. Here's what's happening to that. You impose a carbon tax, and then people adjust. And if he's right about solar, they're going to move in that direction. If he's wrong, they're going to move less in that direction. And so I think there's where I think he would have done well to understand microeconomics, alternately called price theory.
And I think also that's on that topic, the use of sort of an input-output mindset where there's sort of a fixed recipe for producing something is not helpful, because the economy is really adaptable, and you really want to include, substitution and innovation as processes, especially the more long-term you're looking out. So it's one thing if you're, predicting GDP impacts of lockdowns for a 3-month period, because there's a limited extent to which people can adapt. But if you extend that period out, you're going to see adaptation and you're going to see substitution, and that's going to matter. And with something like climate change, where you're trying to, address a problem over decades, you're going to get a lot of adaptation. Of course, that's why economists lean toward things like, a carbon tax, which leaves, the most room for adaptation, rather than, specific, something like specific mandates. This, these cars have to have this gas mileage. But that's something where, he sort of, where, on a lot of things where he's disagreeing with mainstream economists, I'm with him, but that's something where I'm absolutely not with him.
Because
sure.
I do think, he does make a big jump, a big leap, because he is very in tune with the way individuals, these agent-based models, the way they make decisions, but then he seems to be totally ignoring the way policymakers make decisions. And I wanted to bring that into a conversation with him. What if you can make the same assumptions about the policymakers who are going to take these policy responses? And I don't believe in that top-down approach. I just think it was really interesting, at least when you're taking a top-down approach, you realize that there are these substitution effects, these income effects that are taking place at the bottom where people are going to respond in some of the ways that you can imagine they will be, but they're not rational. So they're going to use these rule of thumbs in the heuristic part of it. And you're going to get this mix of responses that are very different than what the policymakers had predicted. And so I just want him to kind of like, again, have a conversation with us, bring in the Austrian, maybe bring in some of the little Hayek, and, you know, so it's somewhere in between. I think we're going to find it. I'm excited about this because I think that this is innovative, and I understand the steps he wants to take in order to bring more of the agent-based modeling up. But I think that he's totally missing it when he gets into the policy space, because he doesn't realize that some of the very same things he's talking about, the rules of thumb and such that exists with the agents that he's modeling and predicting their behaviors, exists at the policy end of it.
And it could be
Yeah,
worse.
yeah.
And the
And
public
well, it
choice
is
people
worse
would,
according to us,
the public
right?
choice people would say it is worse, right?
Yeah,
Because
Buchanan
they have
and
the wrong
Tolek and
incentives.
others. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, as with sort of anybody on the left, there's this tendency to ignore, first of all, unwisdom or errors in the policy area, and secondly, the corruptibility of the policy process, that once you put some, you know, a pot of gold out there for people to get via subsidies or, you know, to avoid losing from penalties, you create some incentives for, you know, corruption, or what economists call rent seeking, to be a more polite way of describing corruption. Okay, I think it's time, if we have some questions, Shelley, to let them come on board.
We do. Tom Gray, if you'd like to unmute, you are ready to go.
Hi, Arnold and David and Tanya, who I'm not so familiar with. I had been reading David in the past. I want to start out by mentioning one of the saddest things I read by Arnold recently about impersonal forces from economics, where he's complaining about the left complaining about rich capitalists moving jobs overseas. And my complaint is related to this because I think a lot of economists have been looking for equations that will work for the 8 billion humans in the same way that chemists look for equations that work for 8 billion atoms or molecules, and that doesn't work. And you've all used rational expectations a little bit, but Tanya also brought up probability a couple of times, and I think that the biggest thing that needs to happen in economics is a lot more work on the differences of opinion being differences in Bayesian probabilistic estimates of what's going to happen based on what you do. And those differences are not necessarily irrational, but they're just different probability estimates. And so I would, the idea that you can model, let's say 8 billion, or maybe you can accumulate them into 8 million sort of representative agents that are more computationally tractable. I think that that's a good idea, but one of the big things that I feel is missing in economics right now is focus on the uncertainty of result from your decisions. And all of the decisions are human decisions based in this uncertainty.
May I, or how do we?
Oh, that's
Sure.
for all three of you, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I like the conversation in the direction you're taking it, Tom, is because we bring in this concept of risk and versus uncertainty, and as we know, Frank Knight is known for the person who brought this up. And when you have risks, you can actually attach probabilities to various outcomes, and that is included in the Bayesian model. Unfortunately, uncertainty injects exactly what it suggests. It's hard for us to get our head around uncertain elements, and there is no predictability piece to it. And so we have to kind of distinguish between the two. But I do think that we need to recognize that mainstream economists, they've stuck with their models in part. They do believe in them, but we have to recognize that, the science of learning, of the mind and psychology and stuff has advanced considerably in the last 5 decades. And then the changes, the lower cost with computation and extracting data and the retrieval of data and cleansing the data and checking it and such, that has just made so much progress in the last 5 decades. In fact, we talk about this just a little bit in the Common Sense book about the evolution or the revolution in transportation and communication. It's allowing us to do more things more quickly and be better at some of the things that we're talking about. So yes, the Bayesian model is one that I think we're going to see more use of it, but we're also going to have to get our heads around the reality that, that we have this element of uncertainty. There are things that we simply don't know, we can't imagine. And it almost brings us back to the Hayekian piece of it. So there are things known and unknown. And with the known, we can attach these probabilities and such, but with the unknown, who knows what's going to happen out there in the game we're going to play. But I like the fact that for reasons that are stated by Farmer, we're going to be able to do it. I think you're going to see some changes in mainstream economics for some of the reasons that Farmer stated, but not because it's Farmer, it's because of the changes in the technology and the cognitive science advancements.
I would just add that to his credit, Farmer does talk about night and risk and uncertainty when he's talking about Chicago on pages 106, 107. And by the way, I see uncertainty a little different from the way you do, Tawni. By the way, it's Tawni, not Tanya.
Oh, that's okay. I'll go by anything.
But I was just telling Tom.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
It's not that it's unknown, because probabilities are for the unknown also. It's not that we can't imagine it. Even if we can imagine it, sometimes we can imagine it and put probabilities on it. Sometimes we can imagine it and can't put probabilities on it. So I was in a discussion on Facebook where I was, an econometrician friend of mine had said, you know what, this idea that vaccines lead to autism is not as absurd as these people said who thought they'd refuted it. And I don't know, by the way, I looked at some of his analysis and I just don't know. But I said, so be a little careful about making this claim. And this philosophy professor said to me, well, what probability would you put on it? Would it be 1 in 10,000? And I said, I don't know. And he got really angry at me. I said, read Frank Knight. I don't know. I think there's some probability, but I can't know what it is.
And this is when the Frank Knight piece comes up, if we go back 100 years ago, nobody in that era could imagine an iPhone or Facebook.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of space that I like bringing the Frank Knight piece, especially when I'm lecturing to different people. There are things that we don't know.
Yeah.
And those things they're incredible, they're wonderful, they're exciting, but there's just no way of imagining it.
Right.
Well, great. Thank you, Tom. John, if you would like to unmute, we are ready for you.
Thank you. First, just follow on to Tom, let me interject. I find myself thinking that there might be an issue of reflexivity. That is, maybe for a farmer's theory to work, economic agents must not know the theory. As if they know the theory, then there's a meta level that complicates whether it converges. But back to my question. Milton Friedman was not merely an economist. He had a vision of human flourishing. And yes, we want policies that are efficient and effective to achieve any given goals. But Friedman and the classical liberal tradition always kept in mind that liberty is a good in itself, right, and that decentralized governance and small government promote broader individual autonomy, responsibility, voluntary cooperation, rather than heavy reliance on majority rule and concomitantly tyranny of the majority, tyranny of the over the minority, and big government. So my question is, does Doyne Farmer grasp the breadth of Friedman's larger vision? And if not, you know, how much are you economists and how much are you more in the spirit of smart social scientists who are thinking about the good life?
So I'd like to try, and it's possible I don't understand your question, but I don't think he does get Milton Friedman's grasp. So when he says in that statement, he says their assumptions, quote, led to conclusions supporting the school's libertarian leanings. It's not a put down, but it's close. And so I think that he's never nasty in that way, but I think he would be very skeptical about the libertarian leanings. And I think part of it is that I think he's, as I said, he's bought into Piketty. He cites Joe Stiglitz. He does all these things that make me think that he doesn't get just how powerful economic freedom is in leading people to the good life. So I don't think he gets that. And I just want to point out, for me to say these positive things about him is not at all for me to say that I'm throwing out all my framework or all my libertarian leanings or all my belief that economic freedom leads people to flourish. When I see a new idea and I kind of test it and think about it, and I think he's got some new ideas that are worthwhile.
And I agree with you, David. I think that what you said was well stated. And it brings me back to this, like, one assumption that just resonated with me over and over again that led me to believe he does not understand Milton Friedman or Adam Smith. And that's that he constantly labels the people in the classical liberal model as selfish. And I was like, no, they are self-interested. And what if he just switched that assumption? What would that do to all of the modeling and then the work that he does? And that includes, moving up into the policymaker sphere. And again, he doesn't understand that the people, once you enter that platform, that the people that are the policymakers, that we just roll out all of the things that, John said. And even when we just look at the democracy and the tyranny of the majority over the minority, those are the pieces I think I'd like to have a conversation with him and say, okay, let's make this assumption. What happens to your modeling? How does it change? It's worth having a conversation. This is not a person I would totally dismiss and say, no, this is rubbish. This is something okay, let's sit down and game on. Let's have a conversation.
So if you think of the economist as a technocrat, we can kind of raise three objections. One is we don't like the way you're doing your technocratic stuff. In particular, we don't like the representative agent mathematical model. And there, I think we kind of align with Doyne Farmer quite closely. A second argument is, well, even if you do technocratic stuff better, you're still going to make mistakes, and you're going to have the problems of, setting up systems that are corruptible and setting up systems that are flawed. And then the third point to make is that, and this is the point that David's making, or maybe I guess John Alcorn was making, is that liberty is still a good in itself, and dictatorship by technocrats is still dictatorship and still sort of not consistent with general human flourishing for that reason itself. So I think that's kind of where I would come out regarding the sort of the economist as technocrat aspect of Farmer's thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Do we have others?
that was our only two questions that we have.
Okay. All right. Well, then thanks everybody. That was great. Thanks very much, David and Tawny. Great job.
Oh, thank you. Can I add one thing?
Sure.
He has this statement on 259 that workers are poorer than they were 50 years ago. And again, he's just bought a certain narrow part of literature. He's missed out three main things. One is the CPI is what is used to get that. And the CPI overstates inflation, especially over 50 years, because the BLS didn't adjust until the late 90s. And even then they didn't fully adjust. And related to that is they don't include the value of new items. And so if you look at what people have in their homes, it's not even close. It's just not close. And the parts of compensation that are non-pecuniary, the various benefits that firms offer. So I just want to point that out. And again, that tells me he's reading a fairly narrow range of literature.
Yeah.
Tom does have one more question if you guys have another minute or two.
Okay. You have to put them on screen.
Hang on one second. There we go. He's coming. All right, Tom, if you can unmute.
Yeah, thanks. You talked a lot about climate change and your disagreement on his issues, and I haven't read the book, and I'm probably not going to, but I am interested in his view of the predictions made by the IPCC, because it's my understanding that from around 2001. There were 7 different models, all predicting various levels of global warming. And the global warming scare has been sort of renamed climate change, but it actually always was climate change. But global warming and the melting of the ice caps and the rise of the sea level is the single big catastrophe. Everything else, floods and droughts, are available to be adapted. As David was pointing out, the alternative to ending civilization's use of carbon fuels. And it seemed to me that if you have a theory that there's this problem and it's based on these models, and all of the models are basically falsified so far, how do you consider that a scientific theory? So that's my question.
That's a
about
really
that.
good question, and it's one he does not address. And it's the kind of thing, so I would love him to read Stephen Kunin's book, Unsettled, and see what he thinks of that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
And Tom, I do encourage you to read this book. I find it is a good read. I'm glad that the group drew me in on this. And so, yeah, it'll give you a lot to think about and cause you hopefully to go to Liberty Fund and see some of the writing and listen to the podcast. Excellent podcast by Econ Talk, Russ Roberts. And then of course, Arnold has his piece.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Especially thank you, Tawny and David. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us. To our guests, we hope that you guys join us next month in October. We are going to be reviewing Arnold's new piece that just came out, the Cooperative 8. So look forward to that. That should be in the upcoming Econ Lib newsletter. And again, thank you very much and hope to see everybody again very soon.